Good evening. For decades, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency has been galloping out of control, running way beyond its boundaries in terms of actual congressional legislation. And if there is one person who has been working perhaps the hardest to rein it in, to bring it back within its proper bounds, it is Steve Milloy, who is the owner of junkscience.com, a fabulous website that exposes all kinds of bad science in the environmental movement. And he frequently takes on the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, in a variety of different ways. I would call Steve your pit bull against government misconduct on environmental issues. Steve will be our guest tonight and discussing, excuse me, one particular example of not just the EPA, but others uh, making essentially war on good economics, on good business in the name of environmental protection. Before we bring him on, I want to just remind you of who the Cornwall Alliance is, or what the Cornwall Alliance is. We're, well, one way to put it is that we're trying to save the planet from the people who are trying to save the planet. We're a network of just under 70 evangelical Christian scholars, about a third natural scientists, a third economists, and a third theologians, philosophers, and ministry leaders. And we're dedicated to educating the public and policy makers on three things simultaneously and intertwined: biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the very poor around the world, and the gospel of Jesus Christ, together with the worldview, the theology, and the ethics that come with that gospel. So welcome to From the Stacks, which we are pleased to be able to bring to you tonight with our special guest, Steve Milloy. So Steve, thanks very much for joining us tonight. And please take a few minutes and just introduce yourself to our listeners as if you had just walked into a party where nobody knows you, but you are the honored guest at the party, and you have a chance to let people know where you come from, what makes you tick, what are the things that are really burning issues to your heart, why you do what you do. And then after that, we'll start diving into our specific topics for tonight.
Okay, so I'm Steve Milloy. I publish junkscience.com. I've been doing what I do in various forms for about 30 years now, since 1990. And by training, I have a college, a bachelor's of science. I have a graduate degree in statistics. I'm a lawyer, and I have a graduate law degree in securities regulation. I started off my professional life as a securities lawyer, and thanks to Saddam Hussein in 1990, I got bounced out of that when the stock market crashed, and I found myself out of work. So I started work. I was hired to work on EPA issues by a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. He hired me because I was a lawyer, plus I have a background in statistics, and there was this up-and-coming field of risk assessment. And so I knew nothing about the environment coming into this, but boy, I learned a lot quickly, worked on a lot of different issues. It made somewhat of a reputation for myself. Within a couple of years, I was able to go out on my own. I got a contract with the Department of Energy. They were being besieged by EPA. So I started working on a variety of issues, looking into how much of EPA policy is actually based on science, how much is based on politics. And I was astounded to find that virtually all of it was based on politics and not science. And I think what really sort of trapped me in this, 30 years of working on junk science issues is that I could never understand, could never get over the I can think of no better description, just lying about science that's been going on. And, over the past 30 years, so I've headed up nonprofits. I have been an investment manager. I was a columnist for Fox News for 10 years. I had a company executive. I published Junk Science since 1995, and I've worked on virtually every sort of environmental issue in one way or shape or another, and most of my work over the last, I'd say, 15 years has been on climate, because that issue has just eaten up every other issue out there. And so, nowadays when people think about the environment, it's always climate. When I started out, there were pesticides, radiation, waste, Superfund sites, chemical regulation. Um, but now people only seem to be concerned about global warming. So, and that has, various agendas behind it. So I've spent, a good part of my life on this one issue, and it's not going away. And right now, we've got a real crisis with the climate issue because of the political situation in the country. And so that's what I spend my time doing.
Well, thank you, Steve. And for our listeners, let me just point out that Steve's book, um, uh, Scare Pollution, How and Why to Fix the EPA, is available in Cornwall Alliance's online store. Just go to cornwallalliance.org/shop, and you can order a copy of this. And in fact, for about the next week and a half, it is on a steep discount in price. So we'd encourage you to go there for a copy of this really excellent book. It will just scare the devil out of you when you read it and find out the kinds of things that the EPA has been doing, particularly related to one issue that we will discuss as we go on in the program, something called PM2.5, particulate matter of 2.5 microns or less in size. Steve did some very, very careful investigative research and frankly caught the EPA in some highly illegal and, according to the EPA itself, very, very dangerous experiments using human guinea pigs. So we'll be featuring that book in our sale. I'd also invite you to, on Facebook or YouTube, post questions during tonight's interview. We'll be careful to get to those as much as we're able. And our producer will put those up in front of Steve and me so that we can get at them. Also wanted to make mention that through the month of February, as our way of saying thank you, when you make a 100% tax deductible donation of literally any size, we would be glad to send you a free copy of this brand new book by Ronald Stein and Todd Royal, Clean Energy Exploitations. This is all about how the wind and solar industries, through their dependence on China and the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Africa, really depend on slave and child labor in extremely toxic conditions for the most important minerals on which they rely for building their equipment. So this is, I think, a very important book to help Americans understand that so-called clean energy is anything but clean. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just write in either promo code 22-02 or the title, Clean Energy Exploitations. We'll be glad to send you a copy. Now, back to Steve. Recently, New Yorker staff writer David Owen wrote an article calling refrigerators, quote, an agent of climate catastrophe. How old is what you've called the War Against Refrigeration? How did it come about? Why is it such a dangerous thing?
Well, yeah. So this issue goes back almost 40 years now. In the 1970s, a couple scientists did some experiments and determined that chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which are were the primary refrigerant of the time, when they interacted with ozone. It's a three oxygen molecule. There's two types of ozone.
Hmm.
There's ground level ozone, which is smog, and stratospheric ozone, which shields the solar UV rays from striking the Earth, in too great a quantity. And so they launched this with their basic chemistry. They launched this hysteria that chlorofluorocarbons, freon, uh, deodorant, antiperspirant, refrigeration, all those applications, that it was dangerously thinning the ozone layer, and the hysteria during the 1980s produced something called the Montreal Protocol, which was the first global treaty. And the climate
Hmm.
treaty required that CFCs be phased out and replaced with another refrigerant called HFCs. Now, the thing is, while the scientists who came up with the original, um, chemistry behind CFCs and ozone, I mean, they had the chemistry right, but what they didn't have right was how this all actually worked in the environment. Yes, CFCs destroy ozone when they interact, but then, the ozone quickly reforms. And, and so, over the past almost 40 years, we've been, phasing out CFCs, and they've been replaced with HCFCs, and there's never really been. First off, there was never any harm coming from the ozone hole, which was over Antarctica to start with. No on Earth was there ever measured an increase in UV radiation, and since the banning of CFCs, the the so-called hole, it's not really a hole, just sort of a thinning of ozone over Antarctica, has changed. Sometimes it's bigger than the hole, sometimes it's bigger than 1 year. It varies in size between years. We've never been able to really figure out, what the rhyme or reason for that is. But nonetheless, that has not stopped the panic over refrigerants from proceeding over the past 40 years. Now, the environmentalists were very successful in getting the Montreal Protocol signed because the chemical companies, they saw an opportunity to come up with a new chemical to replace CFCs, which they could profit from and extend their intellectual property rights. And so we've been engaged in this game now for 2 generations. And just recently, Congress passed a law that banned the most recent class of refrigerant, HFCs, under the guise of climate, and they moved past ozone. So now they're up to HFCs. Those are going to be banned and replaced by nobody knows what, because the technology doesn't really exist. I mean, there are options out there, but we don't really know. Now, the reason HFCs were banned, I mentioned, is because of climate. The environmentalists have convinced, a number of politicians that HFCs are one of the most potent greenhouse gases out there. They have also convinced Republicans, or I should say the refrigeration industry has convinced Republicans, similar to what they did in the 1980s, that they need to make even more expensive refrigerants and with new intellectual property rights. So, this is a giant scam that's being perpetrated on the public. We are paying more for refrigeration, not refrigeration equipment, air conditioning. When you go to have your car's air conditioning recharged, it's no longer a $50 process. It's a several $100 process because of all the hijinks going on. And
Yeah.
environmentalists, of course, have taken this to the next level, where not only are they going after refrigeration. Refrigeration, of course, is vital to our economy and our health and safety. Well, that's how we preserve food.
Yeah.
And so they're after refrigeration. They're after air conditioning, and they're completely unhinged.
Yeah, they're after air conditioning at a time when they're also warning everybody that we're in danger because of increased heat waves because of global warming. Seems a little bit self-contradictory there, doesn't it? I actually had a
Well,
colleague when I was teaching in college back in the 1990s who was he was a chemistry professor at the college, but he had been a research chemist with the company that owned uh, the patents on the CFCs, and he actually told me that at the in the mid 1980s, in the run up to the Montreal Protocol, that company was intentionally portraying CFCs as dangerous to the ozone layer, though in fact they had no real proof of that. But they were doing that
Right.
because their patents were running out. And the CFCs were actually very inexpensive to produce. And so once the patents ran out, any chemical company could produce them, and the price would plummet, and therefore a major cash cow for this company would disappear. But they had the HCFCs already on the in the new patents, and those patents wouldn't run out for a while. So what they saw was an opportunity to make it illegal for people to use what would soon become the very inexpensive generic products and replace them with a very expensive patented product. And that would be all to their benefit financially. So the follow the money issue really does apply in this case. And what you're saying is that that's what's going on again now in the effort to ban the HFCs.
The Montreal Protocol, I remember maybe 15, 20 years ago, I was in a meeting with Al Gore. And Al Gore was not to reduce the ozone hole. The purpose of the Montreal Protocol was to show the world that we could actually treaty signed. You could actually have a global environmental treaty. So the Montreal Protocol is really this sort of template for treaty now, and so the Montreal Protocol is the template for that.
Yeah. Steve's connection seems, your connection, Steve, seems to be deteriorating. Can I ask you to just log off and log right back in, see if a fresh connection will do any better? For our listeners, we were discussing this actually before we went live this evening. Steve routinely uses his connection to do live television with Fox News and others, and has no problem. So it's not a problem internal to his home. It's also not a problem in terms of our own producer's system. And so there must be something happening on the internet between Steve and us. So we'll see if this fresh login can help that. Welcome back, Steve.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Okay.
Is it working?
Good to have you back. Very good. So one of the issues that you're concerned about now, before Congress and the president, it's before the president right now. If he wants to push it through, he's going to have to get it approved by the Senate. Is what's called the Kigali Amendment.
Right.
Tell us about that, and why should people be concerned about that potential treaty revision?
Well, so the Kigali Amendment is really, it's an amendment to the Montreal Protocol. And, the current class of refrigerants we use right now are called HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. And the Kigali Amendment would ban them. Now, the problem with, when CFCs were banned, at least there was a chemical that, was identified that we were going to transfer. We were going to go from CFCs. But now with HFCs, there's no next generation chemical that's ready. The industry doesn't really know. The only thing we know for sure is that refrigeration is going to be even more expensive. Now, this Kigali Amendment, the Biden administration has just submitted it to the Senate, and the Senate has not taken action yet, and will unlikely take action on it because the Senate is Republican. However, it's not quite sure I'm not quite sure it's going to make a difference, because last December there was a bill passed in Congress and signed by Joe Biden that put EPA to work on banning HFCs, and this was done with the help of a bunch of Republicans, led by John Kennedy from Louisiana, where all the refrigeration industry is. So once again, this is a case of industry, refrigeration industry teaming up with environmentalists to, screw the rest of us.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's economists refer to this, I'm sure you know, as regulatory capture. If if regulation of your industry is on the table, you want to be seated at the table to make sure that you get to determine what's going to be in that regulation. And so the big companies that are already very profitable in that industry are going to be heavily involved in lobbying regulators and legislators in order to get legislation passed that favors them, which is which means that a whole lot of the regulatory work of the government on pollution, on environmental issues, whereas people think, oh, yes, definitely, we want the government protecting us. A whole lot of what actually happens instead is that the government is protecting big business of various sorts at our expense. And that's exactly what's happening here. Um, I want to switch our focus now to an issue about which you've written a great deal, and you've been involved in some litigation about it, and that's the issue of PM 2.5, particulate matter that is 2.5 microns in diameter or less. This is extremely fine. It's uh, what's the fraction of the width of a human hair that would be PM 2.5?
1/20th of a human hair. Very small. Yeah, so
Okay,
PM
so this is
2.5 is,
teeny tiny stuff. Yeah.
yeah. Well, and
So
PM 2.5, do it every day. It's basically just, fine dust or soot. And it's produced by any sort of combustion, fires, forest fires, comes out of smokestacks and tailpipes. It's very small. People who smoke, they inhale PM 2.5, a great deal of it. And it is EPA's theory that any exposure to PM 2.5, even one molecule, can result in death. And EPA has in the past estimated that as many as 1 in 5 deaths are caused by PM 2.5. And PM 2.5 has magic toxicity. It can kill you an hour after you inhale the molecule, or it can kill you 80 years later. We're not, it's just magic molecule. It can do anything. And the Obama EPA, well, starting with the Clinton EPA, they started building a regulatory regime based on PM 2.5, and it sort of culminated in the Obama years when the war on coal was justified by reducing PM 2.5 air, and and the way the game works is that, as I mentioned earlier, PM 2.5 is blamed for deaths. And when EPA reduces PM 2.5 levels in the air, they assume that they're reducing deaths, and every death reduced is economically worth $10 million to EPA. And what's happened over the years is that EPA has figured out how to game cost-benefit analysis. When I first started in this business 30 years ago, industry could defeat a lot of over cost-benefit analysis. What are we getting for the cost of regulation? EPA didn't like that, and so they overcame, that with PM 2.5, because if you say that PM 2.5 kills hundreds of thousands of Americans every year, and every death is worth $10 million, well, you're coming into imaginary regulatory benefits in the tens of billions of dollars, and there's nothing industry does that can match that in terms of costs. So EPA has developed this. It's the perfect scheme to advance the regulatory agenda. The Biden administration now plans to use PM 2.5 as a sort of proxy for regulating climate, because you can't get a climate law through Congress, but using PM 2.5 as a proxy for carbon dioxide, they hope to be able to regulate fossil fuel use in the United States. I know this is, it's a lot. I've really tried to summarize. I have done a very good job.
We're going to take this apart a little bit more, bit by bit here. But right from the start, you mentioned that the EPA actually says that PM 2.5 can kill people at extremely low exposure. In fact, even one molecule. I've seen the language on the EPA's website itself, with the EPA claiming that extremely low exposure to PM 2.5 can kill you. Now, I would think that just any ordinary person would recognize how insane that is, because we all know that every day we're breathing in stuff that is that small or smaller. It's just part of life. There's no way that you can get away from that stuff. How in the world does the EPA come to the conclusion that exposure to PM 2.5 at, say, I'm going to pull numbers out of the air here. This is just purely for illustration's sake. At say 70 parts per million can kill you, and if it can kill you at 70, then it can also kill you at 5. And so we should lower the regulatory standard for PM 2.5 in the air from 70 to 5, even if that's going to cost billions of dollars in retrofitting all kinds of different uh, electric generating plants and all sorts of other things. How do they get to that conclusion that such a low exposure can kill people?
Well, we could spend hours talking about this, but I guess I'll try to shorten this. EPA pays scientists to do research that EPA likes. And EPA has hired a bunch of epidemiologists, a lot of them from Harvard University. They pay them tens of millions. These scientists say crazy things. They make up stuff, terrible statistics, terrible epidemiology, completely ignore some reality, facts, and they literally just make it up. And I can't explain to you how crazy it is. You know, if let's say that you could determine a safe level of exposure to PM 2.5. Well, if you were to do that, EPA would just take that point, draw a line down to 0, and assume that any exposure between 0 and that level will have a bad effect. Answer to your question is they just make it up, and they can get away with it because EPA pays the researchers to do the work. They then pay these same researchers to review their own work under the guise of independent science, peer review. And then based on that, EPA issues regulations which, frankly, are almost impossible to challenge in court because judges are very reluctant to get into scientific controversies when it comes to EPA.
Yeah, they tend to just concede to the regulators the factual claims, and all they want to look at, the judges, are, does the statute support what's going on here? If the facts are right, and they don't want to question whether the facts are right. Part of what's involved here really is central to what you've done through your career, and that's risk assessment. And one of the issues in this is the debate between what we call linear no threshold risk assessment, and then instead a view that says that below a certain level, exposure to a given substance is simply no longer dangerous, no longer risky to people. Explain for our audience why it's so important to get that issue right.
Well, the linear no threshold model is one of the most potent regulatory weapons that the EPA has. Now, the linear no threshold model is the mathematical model that, as I sort of alluded to earlier, if you know something causes harm at whatever exposure level, you then draw a line down to 0, then you have the exposure curve, or how toxic the substance is at various doses. And this is just an assumption. This is not science that EPA uses. the linear no threshold model was began being used by the government maybe 50, 60 years ago. In the beginning, it might have been justified because we really didn't have much data on human exposure to chemicals. But of course, over the subsequent 50, 60 years, we've developed quite a bit of data. We know a lot more than we did, but we don't apply any of our knowledge to the regulatory process anymore. We just assume that if you can show that whatever substance is harmful at whatever level, you just draw the line down to zero, and that's the dose response curve. And it's completely false, but it is how regulation is done in this country. So chemical regulation is done, radiation regulation, air quality regulation, lead regulation. You and I grew up with exposed to lead. It was just part of life. There was lead in the air from incinerators, from leaded gasoline. We were all exposed to it. It was not a problem. But there are kids who have been poisoned by eating, say, lead paint chips. And what the public health community has done is just draw a circle around that eating lead paint chips all the way down to zero, and just assume then that any exposure to lead, and that's false, but that's what they've done. So there are efforts about to during the Trump administration, we tried to have the linear no threshold model modified, but it's very difficult because the scientists that EPA pays and that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission pays, they have a very strong, and there's also the radiation protection industry and chemical protection industry, and they have a very strong grip on that regulatory process, and they'll never let it change.
Yeah, and again, this seems to me to be one of those situations where, frankly, a little common sense really ought to enter into this, not just complex science, but common sense. I mean, most everybody knows, at least adults, it's actually possible to drink so much water that you kill yourself because you overburden your cell's ability to process that water, and your cells begin to burst. But that's an enormous amount of water. But the linear no threshold theory would say that, therefore, you're risking hyperhydration, pardon me, if you have a teaspoonful of water. Now, it may be that the risk is very low, in which case, 250,000 people who have a teaspoonful of water may do just fine. But there's going to be one person somewhere who has that one teaspoonful of water, and it's going to kill him. Now, that's the actual logical implication of LNT, linear no threshold risk assessment, but it's clearly absurd. And this is one of the things where, frankly, citizens, voters, need to apply common sense and need to be committed to not being led around by the nose by so-called experts. Partly because experts are perhaps more prone than anybody else to the psychological phenomenon called groupthink. If you're just an ordinary person and you don't have a reputation to lay on the line as an expert scholar in this, that, or another subject, well, when people start throwing around what seems like a crazy claim in that field, you as an ordinary person don't have anything to lose when you stand up and challenge it. But if you're an expert scholar in that field and a number of other expert scholars in that field start throwing around wild claims, well, you have an incentive to jump on the bandwagon rather than really to critique it carefully. So this is one of those issues where, frankly, citizens, ordinary people like me, need to be very careful to do what the Apostle Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5:21 tells us to do: test all things, hold fast what is good. That's really kind of the bedrock basis of science and scientific method. You test everything, and only what holds fast, only what is good, only what passes the test do you hang on to. Well, tell us, Steve, about some of the experiments that the EPA has done about PM 2.5, because in your book,
Okay.
Scare Pollution, which again, I'll remind people, this is available in our online store. It's on a nice discount. Scare Pollution, How and Why to Fix the EPA, or Why and How, pardon me, to Fix the EPA. Steve writes extensively about the PM 2.5 issue, and particularly about experiments using human guinea pigs about PM 2.5, that if the EPA were right in its claims about the toxicity of PM 2.5, these experiments would be uh, deadly dangerous, and they would violate the Nuremberg Code on the use of human subjects in medical experimentation. Uh, Tell us some history there, Steve.
Sure. So when EPA invented the PM 2.5 scare in the 1990s, it did so with statistics, epidemiology, basically. But of course, epidemiology and statistics are not science. Epidemiology is statistics, and statistics is not science. They realized they needed to have some science behind their statistics, some biological plausibility. Do we know that PM 2.5 really causes death? So to do that, EPA started testing PM 2.5 on human beings, and so they built a gas chamber at the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill School of Medicine. They would hook up this a idling diesel truck to this chamber, and in the chamber they would put people. They would put elderly people. They would put people with asthma. They would put people with various health conditions, and they would expose them to very high levels of PM 2.5 for a couple hours to see what happened. Now, if you think about this, EPA's position is that any exposure to PM 2.5 can cause death in a matter of minutes. And EPA also believes that older people and people who are sick are most vulnerable to PM 2.5. So what's EPA doing? EPA is putting these people in this gas chamber and exposing them to the exhaust from the diesel truck. Of course, exhaust is cleaned up, the carbon monoxide is taken out. So these people are just inhaling the particulate matter. Still, EPA says the particulate matter is what kills people. And so I discovered that they were doing this, and it was quite embarrassing to EPA. They had to stop doing this, and there were some hearings in Congress, and this started a whole kerfuffle in the regulatory establishment. A couple years ago, well, about 10 years ago, we had sued EPA about this. EPA admitted that the reason they were doing these experiments was because they weren't sure of the statistics. They knew the statistics did not prove that PM 2.5 caused harm. So they ran their human guinea pig experiments to see if they could hurt somebody. Now, of course, this violates the Nuremberg principles, which came out of World War II and the Nuremberg trials, where around 20 Nazi doctors were executed for conducting awful experiments on concentration camp prisoners. And here we have EPA 40, 50 years later. What you have to understand is that PM 2.5 is not really harmful, so these people were never really in danger. But EPA was trying to hurt them. EPA was hoping that some harm could be caused so they could justify their PM 2.5 regulation. Of course, of all the people who were exposed, nobody was hurt by the PM 2.5. And EPA got pretty desperate. EPA even gave money to researchers from University of California, Los Angeles, and University of Southern California to blow diesel exhaust up the noses of children as young as 10 years old, trying to show that diesel exhaust from buses was harming children. I mean, this is really sick stuff. But this is what the EPA was doing under the Bush and Obama administrations. Of course, the EPA doesn't matter who's in charge of EPA. EPA's got its own agenda. It's a rogue, out of control agency. They do what they want to do. So it doesn't matter who's president. But this is that human experiment story. And I never really got admission of wrongdoing out of EPA, but they did stop doing the experiments.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think their stopping was in large measure creditable to you and your work. Um, have a quote that I'd like to read here in terms of the importance of just ordinary people having, in many cases, better insights than experts. Winston Churchill in 1901 wrote a letter to H.G. Wells in which he said, "Nothing would be more fatal than for the government of states to get into the hands of experts. Expert knowledge is limited knowledge, and the unlimited ignorance of the plain man who knows only what hurts is a safer guide than any vigorous direction of a specialized character. Why should you assume that all except doctors, engineers, etc., are drones or worse? If the ruler is to be an expert in anything, he should be an expert in everything, and that is plainly impossible." And Churchill goes on to argue that practical judgment is the capacity necessary to making decisions. And practical judgment is something that everyone is capable of to varying degrees. One doesn't have to be an expert to do that. So I think that's an important lesson for us to take away in terms of our role as citizens in relation to regulatory
Well,
agencies.
yeah, no, I think that's very important. I mean, my whole approach to this, ever since the beginning, from the first time I heard that chemical X causes cancer, I wanted to know, how do you know that? How do you know that? And I chased it down and I found out they don't really know that. They're just making it up. And they're just counting on you not being willing to make the effort to find out. And then once you find out, not being able to do anything with the information. We've seen a lot of this. We just lived through a lot of this with 2 years of COVID. And so, science is not, you don't need to be any sort of particular, a lot of the stuff you can figure out on your own if you want to make the effort. And fortunately, now we have the internet. You can make the effort if you want. And it's all I've been doing for the last, I'm fortunate I have a pretty good background, so a lot of the stuff is easier for me to understand because of all the time I've been doing it and the experience I had coming into it. But none of it is rocket science. Anybody can figure this out.
Yeah. Want to take a quick break here to remind our viewers that through the month of February, as Cornwall Alliance's way of saying thank you when you make a 100% tax deductible donation of literally any size, we would be glad to send you, if you request it, a copy of this 350 some page book, Clean Energy Exploitations. This is all about how wind and solar and other renewable energy technologies rely on toxic metals, toxic minerals, mined mainly by slave labor in China and the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Washington, almost said Washington. Maybe we could think that. No, in Central Africa. This is a dirty story, quite frankly, about something that is desperately bad for humanity. And this is a book that you want to read so that you can communicate to your representatives in Congress and in your state legislature, and that every American ought to understand. You see the front cover there has an armed soldier guarding child laborers in a mine in Congo. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just write in promo code 22-02. That's promo code 22-02, or the title Clean Energy Exploitations, and we will be glad to send you a copy of that excellent book. Now back to you, Steve. You and I have a mutual friend in Dr. James Enstrom. He's an epidemiologist, formerly on the faculty of the University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA, He's an extremely accomplished scholar, tremendous publishing record and tremendous record of citations and so on. Excuse me. But when he came out uh, against various claims of human harm being done by various environmental chemicals, he became the target of a lot of attacks, which is common in the environmental movement. If they don't like what you're saying, they'll just attack you personally. They'll try to destroy your career. But his work is of such high quality that it just continues to be important in the field. One thing that you've mentioned is that James has registered a complaint of misconduct against certain Harvard researchers on the topic of PM 2.5. Those are Francesca Dominici and Clarence James Gamble. Tell us about James's complaint to Harvard here, and what do you expect to happen from that?
So, as I mentioned earlier, this is related to PM 2.5 science, and EPA pays for all this PM 2.5 science. The data that is produced should be available to taxpayers. It's not. The people that Enstrom has mentioned in his complaint, they're part and parcel of the system that is PM 2.5 Mafia. They take taxpayer money. They do research, secret. They feed their results to EPA. This turns into regulation. And so, the two people that Jim had mentioned in that complaint, Jim could add 50 more, 100 more to that. These are all people that take taxpayer money, do basically secret research, give the results to EPA. EPA then convenes them to review their own research, and which they, of course, rubber stamp EPA's what becomes EPA science and EPA regulatory policy. These two researchers that Jim has, fixed on now come from the Harvard School of Public Health, or I'm sorry, the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, which was purchased by the Communist Chinese in 2014 for $350 million, and is now chock full of Chinese nationals doing research essentially to wreck America. And so, Jim is just trying to draw some attention, and he and I and a handful of others, were like voices screaming in the darkness. I mean, what's going on is wrong. It's scientific fraud, but the fix is in, and it's difficult to make progress on it.
Yeah.
And I gotta say, we have the phenomenon of cancellation. Jim was canceled out of his position at UCLA because he questioned the dogma of PM 2.5. And Jim and myself and climate skeptics in general, we were the first people to be canceled by environmentalists. It happened a long time ago. So it's awful to see, but it's everyone else is getting a taste of what we've been subjected to for the last 15, 20 years.
Yeah. Now, if I remember correctly, Jim actually sued UCLA for violation of contract and violation of his being a tenured faculty member, and won that suit. Am I right there, Steve?
Yeah, no, he sued and he got a settlement, but he's not at UCLA anymore, and the word has gone out that you cannot. If you're on a university faculty, you cannot question the dogma. If you're at a university today, you can't risk about climate. You're not going to be at that university anymore. They're not going to give you grants. The government won't give you grants. Corporations have been scared off funding people that question dogma, and this is just wrong.
Back during the Trump administration, there was a concerted effort to get through Congress legislation that would have greatly strengthened the requirements of transparency for the scientific work on which not just the EPA, but other regulatory agencies based their regulations. Um, Part of what you're pointing out is that for lack of such required transparency, a whole lot of what we would call secret science turns out to be the basis on which regulations are adopted, but there's no way for other people to test those scientific studies because they're not made public. They're not transparent. What, in addition to, and you can address that very issue itself, but in addition to the need for enhanced transparency of the science, and what would be some of the characteristics of that? What would that involve? What other things really could be done to improve the federal EPA?
Well, I think EPA's mission just generally needs to be reduced. The EPA was formed 50 years ago. No one had really thought about pollution, air quality, water quality. All of a sudden, people focused on it, and the environment has dramatically improved by the time I started doing this work in the 1990s. And but of course, although the environment has improved, EPA has only broadened its mission. Today, most environmental protection is done by the states, most practical and useful environmental protection. But we have this ever expanding EPA that is really out of control now, and is used by a control freak of a government to expand government control over our lives. And now we have this case of PM25. I'll give you an example. Uh, Climate legislation has basically been rejected in Congress. The Biden administration Build Back Better plan had all sorts of climate provisions. It's been rejected. But now the Biden administration is going to go to EPA, and through its air quality regulation, which we'll use as a proxy for climate, it's going to begin cracking down on the fossil fuel industry. Even though our environment is clean, our air is not polluted because of fossil fuels anywhere really in the country. Yeah, there may be a bad air day here and there, but generally speaking, for the amount of we have in this country and all the cars, our air is very clean, as clean as it's ever really been. But that doesn't matter to the Biden administration because they have all this, these secret science. The scientists they've paid off will come and say, yes, this invisible stuff in the air is killing hundreds of thousands of people, and this will be used to justify regulation, which has the same effect as legislation, but doesn't didn't really go through the same process. And there's no real debate about it because the whole process is EPA.
Okay, as we come toward a close here, I do want to pose a sort of a different question to you, Steve. You've been a major critic of a lot of environmental regulation. Do you just simply reject environmental regulation out of hand? Or is there a role? What role is there for government regulation of what economists call externalities that harm other people, but the corporation that produces them is not actually paying the cost of those things? Is there a government role in handling those things? And if so, what is it? How can it be done with honesty, with good science, instead of the way it's being really badly done now?
Well, I'll put it back to you this way. I got into this. My position has always been, I don't care whether you want to regulate it or not. But when you offer up a regulation, you should not lie about what the science is or what you think will be published. And whatever regulation you're proposing must be balanced against the cost, because all regulation has costs. And once we actually see what the real and anticipated benefits are versus the real and actual costs, then people can decide for themselves. And a lot of these decisions should be made in Congress, where these issues can be debated versus EPA, which it's hard to, you can't debate anything at EPA. So, I also recognize that in 1970, in the 1960s, 1970s, when environmental pollution was kind of at its height, we're no longer there. We have a clean environment now. So it's not really a question of whether you're for or against environmental regulation. At this point, it's, well, what's the regulation going to accomplish, and what's it going to cost, and how do we get that debated? We don't really do that anymore. We just get, we're sort of slammed between the hyper-regulatory Obama administration, and the Trump administration was deregulatory. Now we're back into this hyper-regulatory Biden administration. And I don't think it really should be like that. I think that if there's a need for regulation, and in the 30 years I've been doing this, I have not seen a need for new regulation, new environmental regulation. I mean, the laws that were passed in the 1970s were very good. They got the environment to a clean condition by the time I started doing this in the 1990s. And ever since, it's just been good money thrown after bad for usually political purposes.
Yeah. All right. Well, Steve, thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. Do you have any closing comments for us? Particularly, what can ordinary people do about this to rein in out of control regulatory agencies?
Well, I think that people should take the lesson from COVID. And COVID has been a great example of abusive science and incompetent, if not malevolent, regulatory agencies. And don't assume that we're from the government and we're here to help. That's obviously not the case. And don't be intimidated by the subject matter. If you can chase down any of this, people have learned through COVID. They're not epidemiologists. They've been able to figure their way out. What's true and what's not true. We have a problem now. Once you figure out what's true, if it's not politically correct, it's shut down. But that's a different issue. Don't be intimidated, and don't trust me. Let's not go with trust me science or trust me regulatory agencies. Things are very politicized right now. Just don't trust the government. That's all I can say. Do your own work.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Steve. Really appreciate your joining us tonight, and looking forward to seeing you at another conference where we're both speaking. That would be
okay,
a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, and good night, Steve. All right.
Thanks. Good night.
Now, friends, our guest next week is going to be Francis Menton, who runs the website Manhattan Contrarian. All those grand plans to electrify everything in America at the same time that we abandon fossil fuels and switch to wind and solar to generate all that electricity. Well, what if the people drawing up those plans can't do basic math? Well, Menton joins us next week on From the Stacks to discuss what happens when we apply basic math, not algebra, not calculus, not differential equations, just basic math to such plans. And when we fill in the numbers about generating capacity, actual generation, space needed, storage capacity, and the prices for all those things, what do we find out? Well, if you're not afraid you're going to face frequent and prolonged blackouts in a bankrupt country overrun with wind turbines, solar panels, and giant batteries, you're just not paying attention. So join us again next week for From the Stacks with Francis Menton as our guest. One more reminder that through the end of February, we're glad to send a free copy of the book Clean Energy Exploitations to anyone who requests it, as our way of saying thank you when you make a 100% tax-deductible donation of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance. To request yours, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, enter promo code 22-02 or the title Clean Energy Exploitations. One other quick announcement. This is a brand new thing. The Cornwall Alliance has just scheduled a conference for the Mid-South to take place in the Memphis metro area for April 1 through 2, Friday night, April 1, and Saturday morning, April 2. We're going to have speakers on environmental ethics and science and economics and so on. And we would love to have you come to that. Watch your email newsletters from the Cornwall Alliance for news about that and a way to register. The attendance registration will be free of charge, and you'll have an opportunity to hear some good speakers and to learn a whole lot and to meet other people who share your interests. That'll be our conference on I've forgotten the exact title that we've given it. It's so brand new to us at this point. At any rate, Cornwall Alliance Mid-South Conference, April 1 through 2 in the Memphis area. Watch for news. If you don't receive our email newsletters, again, just go to cornwallalliance.org and look for the sign up for updates block and just put in your email address and you'll be all signed up, totally free. Thanks again for joining us tonight, and God bless you. Have a wonderful week.